please join me in welcoming to the stage to deliver her lecture on documentary photography in Apartheid South Africa, Professor Tamar Garb.
Thank you, Martin, and thank you everybody for coming. It's lovely to see so many of you here. Well, documentary photography in South Africa and apartheid culture. As you've already heard, we all have a visual imagination of South Africa during the apartheid years, and it's hard for me to know how familiar you are with the visual culture and the history of South Africa during those years. We're talking about the period of 1948 to 1994, and indeed a certain archive, you might say, a certain inventory of photography helped to construct a public imagination, a global imagination really, of what South Africa was like. And the project of documentary photography constitutes what I think of as one of the great realist projects of the 20th century. When we think about documentary photographs, we have certain kinds of conventions, you might say, in mind. And I've put up 3 photographs here which really are emblematic of those kinds of photographs. We think of black and white images, for the most part. We think of a certain kind of sobriety and seriousness, a certain gravity that is associated with the image. We assume also a certain kind of neutrality or a kind of reportage, a kind of objective, unseen gaze of a photographer recording a world outside. These are the assumptions. I'm not saying that this is true, but these are the assumptions that that adhere, you might say, to the notion of documentary. We think of small-scale images for the most part, and nowadays when we think about the photographic medium, you can think about big blown-up wallpapers and gallery prints, etc. But for documentary, the association often is of a small, rather modest-looking scale, these black and white images. We think of them circulating as well in multiple sites. And the thing about photographic meaning and how it's generated is that it's often mediated by the context in which it is found. So whether you see something in a newspaper, whether you see it illustrated in a book, whether you see it in a magazine or a picture essay or a photo essay, the textual material that circulates around the photograph will help to mediate its meaning, and meaning can shift with photographs. That's one of the things about photography, is that it has this kind of mobile capacity to generate meaning. And we think also, and I'm going to open this up to question tonight in thinking about these issues with you, the relationship between photojournalism and photography, documentary photography particularly, how images assumed to be documents, assumed to be portraits or representations of something that has a veridical claim, a kind of claim to truth, how these circulate in relation to texts and in relation to certain kinds of commissioned articles, perhaps, in newspapers, is very interesting. And the concept of photojournalism and its relationship to documentary is something that I'm going to think about. So one of the key associations with the document is the idea that it is a factual record, sometimes even regarded as a legal document. We can think about the way that photographs might be mobilized in courts, in forms of witnessing, which has these very, very strong associations. And this is why I refer to the notion of realism. Of course, there are a set of conventions, as I'm already beginning to imply, that come to center on the assumptions of the real, the truthful, the record, the act of witnessing, the act of bearing witness, that we'll identify and that we're going to track. One of the other things that we associate with documentary is the erasure of the seeing eye. When you look at photographs like these that are on the screen, you are not particularly aware of the presence, the bodily engagement of the photographer. It's as if the photographer is a kind of invisible record maker in a particular kind of moment. Instead, you're invited to think about an image which is full of information. It's what you could call information rich, or full of details that are meant to inform you. And all of these components, all of these qualities and features coalesce around this concept of the document or documentary? And I'm going to open that up to question as we go through. Now, there's certain photographers who are particularly well known for the way in which they used their cameras during the apartheid years to record. Again, these are inverted commas for those online, big inverted commas over here, my finger movement, to record and to bear witness to a set of social circumstances that often involved taking photographs under duress. During the apartheid years, to take a photograph was a dangerous thing to do. To take a photograph in public space, often in situations of violence or in situations of conflict, and indeed even to record daily life, not only in situations of conflict, led to producing an inventory, a body of work, a set of representations that were regarded as dangerous and that needed to be censored. So many of the images that I'm going to show you today are images that were in fact censored during the period that they were taken, or that were not allowed to circulate within South Africa and circulated abroad. And a whole, you might say, visual imaginary of the image of apartheid circulated in the world's press and in books and in pamphlets and in exhibitions because of the work that was done by photographers like Paul Weinberg in the center. This is an image that we're going to come back to today. When Paul Weinberg took this photograph, you can see it's a very particular moment in which you have a woman gesturing between these two armored vehicles, the Casper vehicles, at a moment of heightened conflict, putting himself in enormous danger to take a photograph like that. So Paul Weinberg will be one of the figures who'll come up for us. The other one is Ernest Cole. Many of you will have heard of Ernest Cole. There's a film going around at the moment by the Haitian director Raoul Peck on Ernest Cole that's just opened all over London, and I'm sure people across the world will have an opportunity to see it. Controversial film. Many people have different views on it, but in any case, Ernest Cole has become one of the figures most associated with documenting life under apartheid, and I'll tell you more about him as we go along. And he himself had to flee South Africa and took many of his photographs surreptitiously, hiding his camera in a sandwich bag or in a pocket or in some hidden place. Or one of the other figures who's extremely well known and associated with the documentary tradition in South Africa in the late 20th century, David Goldblatt, now one of the canonical figures. So all of these personalities and characters and photographers have different trajectories and stories, and I'm going to try and draw out the landscape within which they all worked together with many others as well. So when we think about documentary photography, of course, it's not invented in South Africa. We can go back to thinking about documentary and its debt, South African documentary and its debt to European photography and particularly to American documentary practices, the 1920s and the 1930s, particularly work in the 1920s and 30s which photographed the rural poor and urban environments as well, the work on assignment for photographers like Margaret Bourke-White, one of the most famous American documentary photographers of the middle of the years of the 20th century. And in fact, I will show you some work she did in South Africa as well in the 1940s. But photographers like Constance Stewart Larrabee or Leon Levson in South Africa, this is in the years before apartheid, in the 1940s particularly, I want to give you a little bit of the prehistory, were very much aware of the kinds of photographic projects and work that was being disseminated all around the world. One of the things that I think is really crucial to understand is that when you're talking about photography, you're talking about a very mobile medium. Photography comes to Southern Africa and indeed to Africa at the moment that the camera is invented and photography as a technology is invented in the 19th century. And by the early 20th century, photographers all over the world are very, very connected through publications and the dissemination of photographs. So photographers in South Africa are very aware of the kinds of debates and the kinds of choices, formal choices, aesthetic choices that are being made all over the world and are following those sorts of developments. So when we think about photography in South Africa in the 40s and the 50s and 60s, as we're going to, you're thinking about a network of practitioners who are looking at Life magazine and Picture Post and photographic journals that are being produced in London or in New York and are very aware of the kinds of images that are being produced. So just to remember that you are never talking about a culture that is entirely in isolation. And even though during the apartheid years, the powers that be in the government and the forms of censorship tried to create prohibition against the circulation of images, there is still a huge amount of exchange and awareness of what's going on globally. Now, conventionally, when we think about South African photography, and particularly the genealogy of what we imagine to be documentary and documentary reportage, the advent of Drum magazine is regarded as the founding moment. Some of you will have heard of Drum magazine. It's a very important publishing initiative in the early 1950s. It's billed as the first Black lifestyle magazine. It had at its audiences not only Southern African readers and viewers, but it was distributed and disseminated across many parts of the continent, aimed at a Black readership. And as I say, the assumption is that it was in Drum magazine that this whole world of documentary photography, and particularly its relationship to photojournalism, is really invented. But that is actually a myth. And I want to try to dislodge it a little bit for you by showing you another magazine, a picture magazine, this time from the 1940s, which is very little written about. Drum magazine is very well known. You can Google it and you will find endless material on Drum magazine because it is a very, very important publishing initiative, not only because its readership and viewing audiences were aimed, it was aimed at a new Black urban middle class, but also because many of the people who worked for it, the writers and the photographers themselves, were Black South Africans. So it's a very, I'm not discounting how important it is, and I'll talk more about it and about the photographers who came through it. But it's not true that it's at the origin of documentary photography in South Africa. For that, you need to go to a much less well-known publication, a magazine called Libertas, which is actually South Africa's first widely distributed picture magazine. Now, it has a very interesting formation. It was founded in December 1940, so 11 years before Drum magazine, which is founded in 1951. But it had a very, very particular brief. It was founded as a propaganda and advocacy vehicle for the war effort. South Africa, under General Smuts, had gone into the war to fight on the side of the Allies. But that was a very controversial decision, and there were many, many people and many constituents within South Africa that would have preferred to go into the war on the side of the Axis forces and the Nazis. So Smuts and the liberal South African communities around him, paternalistic, of course, invested in white supremacy, of course. I'm not saying they're radicals or revolutionaries, but they were very involved in this idea that what they were protecting was the so-called free world, and that South Africa had to fight on the side of the Allies in order to do that. And in order to advocate for that war effort, they came up with this idea of a picture magazine. And this is interesting for a number of different reasons, and not least because of the role that photojournalism and documentary takes within this context. So where did it get its sources from? Going back to the idea that we're not talking about some isolated little outpost in the tip of Africa where nobody knows what's going on in the rest of the world. Remember, you're dealing with very, very interconnected forms of communication. So magazines like Life, very famous picture magazine, or Picture Post, these were the sorts of magazines that formed the pictorial underpinning, you might say, that gave the format for something like Libertas. And you can see that when you look at the cover of Libertas, how it's even graphically reproducing the look of Life or Picture Post. And in Life and Picture Post, you will know that many photographers were employed through this photojournalistic environment to illustrate stories about daily life, etc. So it's important to remember that this is a very closely connected network. Now, Libertas is associated with one of the most famous of South Africa's photographers of the mid-20th century, a woman called Constance Stewart, who was most famous in the 1940s for what were called native studies. And you see an image on the right-hand screen here of one of her famous studies of an Ndebele mother and child. That is just one example of many of these kinds of ethnographic studies that she produced. She had studied at the Bavarian State Institute for Photography in Munich in the 1930s. She learned a certain kind of modernist, formalist understanding of what it is to compose a photograph. Nobody would say that that was a documentary image. It's a kind of formal, modern, very composed, very stylized representation of a so-called native. Yeah? And she had all sorts of ideas about the beauty of South Africa's indigenous people, these idealized representations of native studies, a concept and a word and a phrase, which is now, of course, deeply problematic, again, because of the kinds of assumptions, racialized assumptions, and the forms of paternalism that underpin them. But nevertheless, in her mind, they were seen as these great paeans, these great homages to the beauty of African people. So that was the way she would have rationalized it. She was also a portraitist, and she had her own portrait studio, photographing all sorts of celebrities at the time. There you see a self-portrait of hers. But what's interesting is at the same time as she's out there doing these so-called native studies, in which people seem to live in these timeless, perfect worlds, she's also documenting the context within which the native study, again, native study in inverted commas, in which the native study is being actually produced. And if you look at this kind of photograph, you'll see that most people in South Africa in the 1940s were not running around in the landscape with assegais and spears and in so-called traditional or tribal dress. It's a time of great urbanization, of industrialization, of the vast swathes of the African population coming to work on the mines or in the towns or in domestic service or as laborers. And that whole emergence of an awareness of contemporary life for African peoples and the politicization of African people who are forming themselves into trade unions and activist groups and developing political parties, etc., runs counter to this very idealized image of the native study, which produces this image of the timeless African in some state of a kind of primeval bliss in the countryside. But if you look at a photograph like this one that I have on the screen, you'll see that this is the set, you might say. It's almost like a film set on which the native study is premised, where you actually have the person in the center standing with his stick and the two other men, one man reading in his top hat and another man in his shorts. These are the people who help to broker the situation in which Constance Stewart can make her photographs of idealized so-called natives in their state of primeval innocence. So now I bring this up in order to think about what a documentary photograph is. So if you look at a photograph like this, it wouldn't conform with the category or the genre of native study, because what it sets out to do is to reveal the real. This is why I call it one of the great realist projects. What constitutes the real? It's in the contemporary. It's in the moment. It's about life that can be observed. It tries not to fudge over the reality of social conditions, whether they're equal or unequal, of labor, of the situation, the way that it's framed. You can see in the background that there you've got the Ndebele hat, but it's not this idealized representation of some formalist environment. Instead, it tries to uncover something of what the actual social situation is in which people live. And when we think about what realism is and what documentary is, it's a kind of genre of photography that sets out to represent the real. Now, you may say that the real itself is a construct. How we view the real, where we place the border, how you frame a shot, the fact that it's black and white, where you position yourself as a photographer, how you obscure yourself, the image that you construct. You might say that there's a whole aesthetic involved there, but the aesthetic that is constructed is that it makes you believe that what you see is reality. So realism itself deploys a whole series of conventions, but the main underpinning trope of realism is that you believe that this is veridical, that this is true, that this is based on observation. And when we think of documentary, it's underpinned by those assumptions. So, how did Constance Stewart come to be making photographs that, instead of idealizing and creating these kinds of beautiful, formal compositions of representations of the so-called native, what led her there, and how can we use this in order to understand the role of documentary going forward? Well, Constance Stewart, during the war, in the Second World War, was employed by Libertas as their war correspondent. Very unusual, especially in South Africa, as patriarchal a culture as you could imagine finding anywhere in the world. They employ a woman to go to the front and to photograph the South African troops, mostly in Italy, but also in Egypt. And there she goes, you see her here, dressed in her army uniform, going off in 1944 during the war, where this idea that she was there. Why is that important? Because it's got embedded in it the idea of witness. That to be on the spot, to be a reporter, to be a war correspondent, to be a photojournalist, you have to be on the spot with your camera. And what you photograph there then becomes mediated as this record. And you'll see, I don't have time to go into this now, but you'll see from looking at the way in which Libertas printed this is they created a kind of pseudo photo album with little corners so that it looks as if it's somebody's album of their snapshots at the front. So these are all the conventions of design that are used by the magazine to help us to believe in the act of witnessing that Constance Stewart performed. But at the same time, Libertas was not only interested in recording what was going on at the front, it was also interested in imagining what South Africa might be like after the war. What was the point of fighting the war if you didn't have a vision of what was already called the New South Africa? Now, many of us associate this term, the New South Africa, with what happens after 1994, after the first democratic elections. So apartheid is from, as I said, 1948 to 94. 94 is this great break moment. After 94, there's this whole imagining of what a new social dispensation might be in a democratic world. But the phrase New South Africa actually goes right the way back to 1944. And when Libertas was imagining what it might be to produce an image of South Africa post-war, they employed various photographers to go around the country and to document the areas of South Africa where there was social injustice, where there was poverty, where there was disease, malnutrition, or unemployment. So the first extensive photo essays that we have around poverty and around social hardship in South Africa actually appear in Libertas. And I'll show you some examples of them over here. They document all sorts of situations of white poverty was a theme, etc. And the precedents for looking at photographs like this came from the Americans' realist projects of the 1940s, the FDR project, the projects of documenting poverty in rural America. So Constance Stewart Larrabee's images during this period, like these ones over here, of urban blacks, for example, are very important precursors, you might say, to this documentary tradition. And she, as I said, is looking at American photography of many, many different kinds, as are all the photographers in South Africa. And a key publication like 12 Million Black Voices, the Richard Wright publication of 1941, is one of those key and important sources. And you can look at these are the sorts of images then that Constance Stewart is producing in the 40s, in the 1940s, late 1940s, which document rural poverty. Margaret Bork-White comes herself to South Africa from America during this period. She comes on assignment for Life magazine, and she makes many, many photographs of poverty and of life, really, in South Africa, including her very, very famous photo essays on the mines. Now, we're going to come back to look at the mines in detail, because photographs of the mines and the conditions of mine workers are one of the themes that recur amongst many documentary photographers going forward. South Africa's wealth is founded on the mines, and the labor of many, many African men who are brought in from the rural areas to work on the mines in very difficult conditions, in suffocating heat and many, many miles underground, with huge social consequences, both for the communities they leave behind and for their own health and for the way in which they live in compounds, and etc. The mining underpins so much of the wealth of South Africa, but also of the history of duress under which people live. So the mine as a theme is one that is very, very interesting. And as I say, Margaret Bork-White, this is a double-page spread from Life magazine, where she's already covering this in the late 1950s, an article on young natives who go to the gold mines, and those photographs, which you often see circulating as if they're autonomous. Many of them were made as illustrations for these kinds of photo essays. So they have multiple lives, as I said in the beginning, photographs. They can circulate in different sites, but many of them originate from projects in which the photographer is commissioned to document a certain social phenomenon, like the gold mines. So that's very important in terms of the relationship between Life, Picture Post, Libertas, and you might say the prehistory of documentary photography and the realist project. And there are photographers who, like, for example, Leon Levson, one of the important examples of a documentary photographer in the 1940s and 1950s. He started to go into rural areas and urban areas to photograph Black South Africans and to capture the conditions under which people worked and lived during this period. So he's an important figure, and he's one of the figures whose body of work then became used and deployed in relation to the anti-apartheid movement. So the anti-apartheid movement, which develops globally later on, begin to use the photographs produced by these photographers as forms of advocacy. Yeah? They become weaponized, these photographs, in narratives about the social conditions in which the majority population in South Africa lives, and someone like Leon Levson's work is circulated globally as evidence, you might say. Another photographer who's also very important in this early period is Elie Weinberg. Both Leon Levson and Elie Weinberg are Jewish immigrants to South Africa from Lithuania. Weinberg was very active in the Communist Party in South Africa, a party that was banned under the apartheid government. But he joins the Communist Party in the 1930s, and most of his work was shot on consignment for left-wing magazines like New Age. for example, and then was collected into books like Portrait of a People. They come to stand for a certain kind of protest imagery that is associated with this whole culture. So Levson and Weinberg are important figures from the 40s and the 50s. Go back to where I started when I was thinking with you about what a documentary photograph is associated with. Small, black and white, the occlusion of the photographer who seems not to be there, this idea of witness, the idea of evidence, the idea of information, a photograph that's full of detail. Yeah? These are the things we associate with documentary photography, and you associate it with a certain kind of a record of the contemporary world, something that's happening in the moment. So, as I said, usually documentary photography is traced to Drum magazine, but I've given you some sense of a prehistory of it from the 1940s. But Drum magazine is a very important organ and a very important vehicle for the dissemination of a certain archive of imagery and for the professional work of a whole series of photographers, particularly black photographers, for whom the opportunities to work professionally are very few within the segregated worlds of apartheid South Africa. I'm assuming that most people in this audience will know that jobs are reserved for particular population groups within the years of apartheid. Not anybody can do any job. Education is, of course, completely differentiated depending from which population group you come, where you can live, where you can move, where you can work, who needs a pass, who doesn't need a pass. All forms of daily life and mobility, professionalism are organized through systems of law and through a very coercive system of police enforcement, during the apartheid regime. So to be a black aspiring photographer is a very, very difficult thing to do. It's very difficult to navigate the world. It's difficult to move around. It's difficult to circulate. It's difficult to be trained. All these things are very, very hard as a black photographer. And Drum magazine is very crucial because it provided a context in which black writers and black photographers could have professional skills, they could learn, they could be trained, and they could function and work as equals, as adult equals within the world rather than being excluded. As I've said before, Drum itself is taking its sources from various other publishing outlets like Life magazine, and it becomes this environment in which photographers, Bob Gosani is a very important example, or Peter Magubane. These are two black South African photographers who make photographs for articles that are published in Drum magazine, taking photographs that have now become canonical, part of the South African archive for this particular kind of context. And in this context, the photo essay is key. Yeah? So people are commissioned journalists are commissioned to write about certain kinds of social phenomena or events. For example, the campaigns against carrying a pass that women enacted in the 1960s. And then photographers are commissioned to take photographs that go along with these articles. So here's an example of Peter Magubane, one of, as I said, Drum magazine's key photographers taking on a particular issue. And the covers of Drum magazine have also become extremely famous. You can Google them and see a whole range of them. Here's a photograph that Bob Gosani made, one of the most famous photographs of Nelson Mandela boxing on a roof in Johannesburg. So Drum is this very important context. And here's a lovely photograph showing the picture editor of Drum magazine's Jürgen Schadeberg, who's a German photographer who came to South Africa as a very, very young man, becomes the picture editor. And it's he who becomes a mentor for many young photographers. Bob Gosani, for example, who made the photograph of the Mandela boxing, started at Drum as a messenger. It's very hard. There was things called job reservation, very hard to get a job, a professional job, but you could always get a job as a messenger, or a tea boy, so-called, or a driver. Yeah? So people, or a darkroom assistant. You could get jobs like that once you got into Drum magazine, if you had a certain kind of ambition or you wanted to train, Jürgen Scheideberg and the community at Drum would train people. And Bob Gosani came in like that. Peter Magubani came in as a driver and a messenger. Ernest Cole, famously also, came in to Drum magazine in this way. And here you have a photograph of Jürgen Scheideberg with Peter Magubani and Bob Gosani, another photograph of Ernest Cole, who, at this point, Ernest Cole is looking at photographs of Henri Cartier-Bresson and French photography and trying to use the skills that he's developing to turn his own camera on local communities and groups. Now, Cole is one of the most important figures of this early period. His most famous achievement, I suppose, is the book House of Bondage. Many of you, I hope, will have heard of it. It was published in New York in 1967. After Cole leaves South Africa, he escapes from South Africa after having been harassed in all sorts of ways by the police. The photographs that he had been taking had been done surreptitiously because of the danger of documenting life at this time. And he became friendly or got to know Joseph Lelyveld, who was the New York Times correspondent in Johannesburg at the time. Lelyveld helps him to move to New York and helps him then to produce this book, House of Bondage, which included many very important canonical images, like this one of a medical examination on the mines, where it's accompanied by text, and the whole construction of House of Bondage is very interesting for the relationship between text and image. House of Bondage is published as if it is Cole's words. In fact, it's written by Lelyveld after conversations with Cole, and there's now a lot of research that shows that the way in which selections were made for House of Bondage was not always in Cole's control. His broader archive has now appeared, and there are all sorts of interesting ways in which photographs are cropped and made to signify in certain ways. But it's one of the most important photo books of the late 20th century, and certainly of the South African archive. So remember, he takes these photographs surreptitiously. For example, how you take a medical examination in the mines. He smuggled a camera into his sandwiches in a brown paper bag. And there are many stories of how he functioned in this surreptitious way. At the same time, as I said, remember, your photographers in South Africa are connected globally. The Family of Man, the very famous photographic exhibition in 1958 that was curated by the Museum of Modern Art in New York and went all over the world, comes to Johannesburg in 58, and it's seen by Ernest Cole, by Peter Magubani, by the young David Goldblatt at this point. So they're very, very aware of the photographs that are going on globally, and they're huge amount of coverage of exhibitions like The Family of Man across the press in South Africa, including in Drum magazine. But Cole himself, his work is published globally, not only in House of Bondage, but Joseph Lelyveld did an article in the New York Times in 1966, before House of Bondage was published, and it's illustrated by Cole's photographs. So just to give you a sense of what House of Bondage looks like, it's, as I say, these extensive essays on the social conditions of life in South Africa, accompanied with photographs like the ones that you see over here, with texts and captions that stand to explain, you might say, the content of the images. But in so doing, by this kind of mediation of the image, a very particular interpretation, you might say, of the images becomes standard, becomes orthodox. And a lot of the scholars who work on these photographs now want to open up the possibilities that you might also want to read them in different ways. Here's another example from another page of House of Bondage, or here's another example from House of Bondage, and the caption read, "Handcuffed blacks were arrested for being in white areas illegally." Yeah? So it's very interesting to think about mediation. And the photograph that I had right at the beginning about signage for whites only is the caption of this particular group of photographs. And you'll see another way in which they are organized on the page. They're cropped, they're made to sit together. This land of signs, this world of signs in which mobility is curtailed and people's access to different environments is predetermined by the system of racial classification that operates within the society and that is actually entrenched and enforced by law. So there's this whole strain of documentary work that's associated, as I say, with a certain kind of photojournalistic culture. Magubane is another very interesting figure in relation to this, and he was one of the people who photographed the Sharpeville massacres. Some of you will have known that in 1960 there was a massacre of people protesting against the enforcement of pass laws, and people were shot at and killed in their hundreds by the security police, and then there were these mass funerals. And Magubane is one of the ones photographing on the spot, and of course his photographs also end up in Life magazine. So here is the article in Life magazine where you see that photograph functioning there as a record of life lived in this incredibly violent environment. Another photographer who was also there at the Sharpeville massacre is someone called Ian Berry, and his photographs have been used as a means of reconstructing the events of that day. How did the day unfold? What was the weather like? Who was there? How did the police turn on the population? And photographs like these come to be emblematic of Sharpeville. These again were circulated all around the world, and many South Africans left. These are some of the images that actually fired up the awareness, you might say, of the whole apartheid machine. I'll give you some other examples of these images. Now, 76 is also a very interesting moment, because 76 was a moment of protest against the enforcement of Afrikaans as a medium of education in schools in South Africa. And the school children across the country start to protest. They have peaceful protests. They're kids, they're high school kids across the land. And this also turns into a very, very violent massacre. One of the canonical images of this period is the photograph of Hector Peterson. This is the child being held Pieta-like in the arms of one of his school friends and being taken to a car to go and get medical treatment, but he's already dead by then. This photograph becomes a very important image in the apartheid archive and is circulated across the world. Yeah, this embodies the image of the massacre of the innocents. At the same time, in the late 70s and early 80s, a whole culture of magazines that are politically engaged emerges in South Africa. For example, the magazine Staff Rider, that is founded in 1978 in the wake of these 1976 uprisings. Photographers like Paul Weinberg and Santu Mofokeng, another figure who I'm going to introduce to you in a minute, start to produce this magazine, which is both for articles about contemporary life, but also is full of photographs, of documentary photographs, these kinds of small black and white photographs. And through the 80s, you find exhibitions and publications, many of which are censored or are banned in South Africa, but which circulate around the world and which help to inform the anti-apartheid movement and a global awareness of life in South Africa. So this whole documentary tradition doesn't only exist within South Africa under duress, documenting life. It has a whole history of circulation within political advocacy around the world. And at the same time, there are all sorts of debates going on in South Africa itself and in the neighboring countries, because activism and resistance was very hard in South Africa because it was a police state which curtailed freedom of speech and curtailed advocacy and protest. So in the countries around South Africa, for example, in Botswana, many exiles and many activists or members of the ANC, political advocates gathered to debate what the role of culture was in relation to political resistance. And it's very interesting when you look, for example, at 1982, more than 900 people, including writers like Nadine Gordimer, photographers like David Goldblatt, all sorts of people gather in Botswana, in Gaborone, the capital of Botswana, to debate what the role of the photographer is, or of the artist is, or the writer is, in relation to a system of violence and violation like South Africa. And it's very fascinating to look at those debates because you get all sorts of different positions being articulated. So on the one hand, there are firebrands, like the photographer Peter Mackenzie, who had a very strong sense that in order to justify your life as a photographer at this time, or as an artist at all, you had to weaponize your work as writer or as artist against the apartheid regime. Now, he comes into conflict in this particular context. I won't read the detail of it, with somebody like David Goldblatt. David Goldblatt is, as I said, a very important figure. But David Goldblatt was not so happy with having his role confined to what he saw as the role of propaganda. Now, it wasn't that he didn't see himself as political, but he advocated for the fact that the artist or the photographer needs to have a certain kind of independence if they're going to be witness to a social situation. And he is very unpopular. Here's just the statement that he made at the time. He's very unpopular at the moment because he goes against what is regarded as the powerful impetus of the moment, which is to turn photography into this weapon against the state. Paul Weinberg writes in detail about this, and these are all documents that you can read and see. And Paul Weinberg is involved, together with many other photographers, in setting up a whole agency of using photographs to document and to advocate, to train photographers, to tell the world what's happening. Afropix is a crucial example of the kind of organization that they set up. And they go into, there are many, many publications that exist for this kind of advocacy. Something like the book, The Cordoned Heart, which gathered together many documentary photographers who produce these images that explore and expose, you might say, life under apartheid. David Goldblatt himself finds himself or participates in this context in a very important book, The Night Riders of Kganye, about migrant laborers and the conditions in which they come to work in the cities, the queuing in the middle of the night, the sleeping on the buses and the trains. Other sorts of photographs that appear within this context are ones like these. Again, you'll be able to identify the forms. There's an important woman called Leslie Lawson who does a whole series of photographs around service workers and domestic labor. conditions in which black women work in South Africa at the time, and the Koorland shows photographs like these. Students marching at funerals, people organizing, and then a second book, Beyond the Barricades, which really looks at the culture of protest that emerges in South Africa at the time, and particularly funerals. You'll see what a huge project this is. I'm just skating the surface of what is an enormous project of recording. These are the photographers in Beyond the Barricades. Some of them are names that you will recognize. These are the kinds of images that begin to emerge within this context. But you'll notice, too, that in something like Beyond the Barricades, the spectacle of protest and resistance and the confrontational relationship between the protesters and the security forces and the police is what is really foregrounded. And it's true that there are a whole strain of documentary photographers who become fatigued by this culture of the spectacle and by what Santu Mofokeng saw as a kind of mentality of ambulance chasing. He begins to write and to talk later on about what it was to feel obliged to photograph black blood on the streets, the endless violence against black people and the endless confrontation and the kind of dramatic nature of life. And there's a famous South African writer called Njabela Ndabule who talks about the rediscovery of the ordinary. He writes a very important essay in the 1980s about the fact that black life could not just be circumscribed and confined and controlled and contained in these images of spectacular violence, but that there are all sorts of aspects of life. People dance, people sing, people eat, people raise children, people love, people live in many ways, and that the responsibility of the writer and the artist is to be adequate to the complex, granular representation of social life, not just this declarative confrontation. So within South Africa and within this context of documentary is already a kind of debate and a fissure that's going on. And the figure like David Goldblatt is, of course, key here. As I told you in Gaborone at the conference, he stood up and he said, I don't want to just make my photographs weaponized to the anti-apartheid struggle. What I want to do is document and record the granular detail of life as it's lived in this very unequal country. How do people function? How do they survive? People from many different population groups. And this is just a series of the books of his documentary photographs that are most famous. But in the 1970s, a project like On the Mines, where he's looking at the conditions of people living on the mines. It has this kind of epilogue from Camus that you can see. He starts to, this is just one project I'm going to show you for an example, which is not about the violent confrontation, but is more about the social conditions and the conditions of light and labor and life that a context like the mines involves. So here are some examples of his documentations of the mines and of people living, of the shaft sinking down underground, taking these without a flash. They almost have a kind of eerie, metaphysical quality to them, as you'll see, plus portraits of people working on the mines. Another project of his looking at the ruling white section of the population, the Afrikaner, looking at the relationships that emerge within communities like this. The transported of Kwandabeli that I showed you before, this comes out as a book. So here are some of the images. And just to finish off, I want to contrast him with the figure of Santu Mofokeng, another of the great giants of South African photography of the late 20th century. So Mofokeng came up through Afropics, through that environment of advocacy and anti-apartheid confrontational recording and photojournalism. This is the kind of early work that he produced, also looking at these images of protest and at these classic canonical images of fists and banners and violence, as you can see. But Mofokeng writes about the fact that at a certain point, he became sickened by the obligation to work in this way, and particularly images like this, which are so, in a sense, emblematic of this cruelty and violence of the period. And he moves on to doing many different kinds of photographs. Many of them are now collected together in this series of books. But this comes from a series called Train Churches, where he looks at the way in which the transport system, again, of commuters, like Goldblatt had looked at the transported of Kganye, the commuters coming into Johannesburg, the way they turn those trains, which are, you might say, emblematic of the hardship under which people live. But what happened in the 1980s in many of those churches is that they became, you might say, traveling churches. People sing, people preach, people read, the train becomes like a kind of cacophonous drum. And he does a whole project on train churches, looking at the way in which people become resourceful in situations of hardship and duress, so that he does this extraordinary group of photographs around the way in which the space of the train and the idea of the commute and the system, the incredibly unequal system that makes certain people have to go in these overcrowded environments into the city in which they're not allowed to live because of the Group Areas Act, but where they have to come to work and then get turfed out every evening, these trains themselves become these cacophonous, melodic spaces. And he does his whole photograph of his whole series of photographs of the singing, the clapping, the chanting that goes on within these extraordinary environments. So I know we're running out of time, so I have more to share with you, but I think I'm going to stop with Mofokeng. This is another whole series he does around signs within the landscape, in order to indicate that there are photographers who came through that. And there's an ongoing world of advocacy and oppositional photographs going right the way up to the Bang Bang Club that some of you will have heard about in the 1990s. So that strain continues. But there is also a whole world of photographers who turn their gaze, in a way, on what they would understand as the complexity of social life as it's lived during the period. And in fact, you might even say that creating this binary between the struggle photographer, as they were called, these oppositional photographers, and the more nuanced documentary photographer is in itself a simplistic binary. Because many of those photographers who we got to know as the ones who photographed the fists and the banners were also making photographs of people in their communities and the daily lives that they lived. So I'm going to stop it right there. Thank you.